Hi, I'm Jon Elsasser, and I'm an adjunct instructor in the MBA program at Ashland University. I have taught a class for the last 8 years in strategy and strategic planning, and I'd like to share that with you today. My background, besides being an adjunct instructor, I have worked for over 33 years in manufacturing and banking, with most of that being in manufacturing. I've been a general manager. I've been a plant manager. I worked in Brazil for 5 years, in Europe for 5 years, did strategy and acquisitions for about 3 years, and then managed an IT area, technology area for about another 7 years. So I've got a pretty broad background, but one of the areas I've always enjoyed working on is strategy and strategic planning. And so let's go ahead and share my screen with you here. One of the things that has occurred to me as I've taught the strategy and strategic planning course at Ashland is that there are a lot of parallels between these concepts for an organization, whether it be for-profit or nonprofit, and for an individual in thinking about the strategy and strategic planning for their career. So today, while we're going to focus mostly on the organizational aspects of that, I do want to, from time to time, make sure we think about how you can also use these tools to help you, in fact, in your career. The content we're going to talk about today is from the Ashland University MBA 517 class. And in that class, we typically use a textbook called Crafting and Executing Strategy by Arthur Thompson Jr. I think it's really an excellent textbook. It has some great models, some good cases, and just as a very good source of, I think, current thinking on both developing strategy and then how you go about executing that successfully. So certainly if you would take this course, you would use it. And even if you wouldn't, I would recommend, if you ever want to get some information on it, this is a great source of content. Where I like to start looking at the whole strategic and strategy development and strategic planning process is a model called the 7S model, or a diagnostic model for organizational effectiveness, because that's what we're really trying to do. What we're trying to do with a good strategy and good strategic planning is having an organization that competes well and is effective and wins. And so this model is a good tool to diagnose that. And it was developed by consultants at McKinsey and Company, who have some really great thinking around the business world. And so I think it has some very solid underpinnings. The 7S model starts really with superordinate goals, or a vision, or shared values. In other words, where are we trying to take this organization? Where do we want it to go? That's the starting point. Next, we have to think then about our strategy, and that's what we'll talk about mostly today, and that is, how are we going to compete? Where are we going to compete? What actions are we going to take to achieve that superordinate goal? We'll talk a little bit today about the skills of an organization. This is not the skills of individuals like me or you in a company. This is the skills of that organization. What makes that organization what they are? If we would think about somebody like Apple Computer, we would say it's technology, it's product design and development, it's product launch, and it's marketing. It's not manufacturing, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So what are those skills that the organization has and really needs to keep better than other people if they're going to achieve those goals and execute this strategy? Next is the style of an organization. This is really its culture. What sort of makes this organization what it is culture-wise? There was a company, Nucor Steel, well-known mini mill steel producer, tends to locate in smaller towns close to their customers to reduce costs. They're really a lean, mean fighting machine in the steel industry and have done very well. And for many years, their corporate headquarters, much like the rest of their company, being simple and lean and mean, was in basically a strip shopping center in Charlotte, North Carolina. It was on Fifth Avenue. It wasn't in Pittsburgh on Grant Street. It was really very lean, mean, and just functional, which is kind of how you would describe the company. Very important part of the 7S model are the systems that you use in an organization. So, what are your information technology systems, but equally importantly, what are your other systems? What HR system you use to find the best people, the people that fit into your organization? What HR system you use to motivate people to achieve the kind of results you need? What are your order fulfillment systems? What are your supply chain systems? Are those systems that are really better than other people's? Have you been able to figure out ways to kind of combine automation and people to have a system that delivers faster, better, cheaper than other people? Those are the kind of things you want to think about there. We also talk about staff. Now, this is really having the right people in the right places. So if you think there's a James Champy book, and he talks about having the right people in the right seats on the bus. And this is what this is about, having the right people that embody the skills, that have the culture, that are in the functions that you need in order to compete. And then lastly, we talk about the structure. And I always like to talk about it lastly, because I think while it's certainly very important, it isn't the starting point. It really falls out of everything else. I had a work colleague that used to say that structure follows strategy. And I think that's true. Once you've got all these other 7S's right, then you'll find a structure that fits with that. And as we know from probably being involved in many corporate restructurings, there's a number of different structures that can work. Some are better than others. But again, in this model, what's important is that everything fits together and it's harmonious and it's consistent. And a solid plan, a solid strategic plan really has to address all of these issues and make sure that in fact they are harmonious and fit together. Now, this is one of those cases where I think we can also take this model and talk about it for you in your career. So obviously we start with our goal. What do we want to do? What do we want to be? We think about our strategy. What are our actions that we're going to use to get there? How are we going to differentiate ourselves from other people? Where are we going to compete? How we talk about our skills. What are we good at? Are we a good communicator? Are we good technically? Are we good analytically? Are we creative? What kind of bundle of skills do we bring to our career? Talk about style. Okay, what's our culture? What's our style? Are we a people person? Are we, again, kind of cerebral? Are we more outgoing, introverted? Again, it's not that any of those are good or bad. They just have to fit together. Now, in this case, staff doesn't make much sense because we are the staff. So I like to think here, at least when we think about personally, it's probably the effort we put into it. Your results in terms of your career are going to be proportional to the effort you put into it. I'm almost positive. Next week, we could talk about systems. What are those systems you use to kind of keep up and make sure that you've got the right skills, that you've worked on your style where it's appropriate. Again, you can't change yourself maybe fundamentally, but you can adjust yourself a little bit. I had a boss who was an excellent communicator, and he just was fantastic. And that was one of the reasons he was so successful as both a manager and as a leader. And early in his career, one of the things he had done is he would actually sort of get into his business attire, and this was in the days when everybody wore three-piece suits and ties, but he would deliver presentations to himself in front of the mirror to make sure that he came across the right way. And that investment in those systems was really yielded results for him. And then lastly, structure is kind of, how do you structure your life? How are you making sure you're balancing, personal and work, learning new things, lifelong learning, making sure you balance between family and hobbies and work, and just, again, make sure you have the right kind of structure in your life to be successful. So again, I think this model, while it's certainly oriented towards organizational effectiveness, I think you can also use it as a diagnostic a bit for your own career effectiveness. So now let's move to the strategy making and strategy execution process. And we'll go through each one of these boxes in a little, in some detail, and a few of them in a bit more detail. So strategy making really begins with thinking about your external environment, the company's external environment. Although, again, it can also be your personal environment as you think about your career. And so one of the tools that we can use is this macroeconomic environment view in the textbook we use. And it starts on that outside ring with kind of the big macroeconomic factors, the general economic conditions. Is the economy expanding or contracting? Legislation or regulation that might affect us. Changes in population demographics. Are we an aging population, or we have a lot of youth? Do we have a lot of immigration, or do we not have immigration? Again, that's not a political issue. That's a question: are the demographics of your population changing? What's happening in technology? Is Are there technology trends, Internet of Things, social media, any kind of things of that sort that, in fact, are changing the way we do business. And then there's social values and lifestyles. To what degree are those changing the way people use our product or our service or how they view us or whatever? So those macroeconomic factors, obviously, in an organization are very important. They're really going to say a lot about the kind of headwinds that we're going to be facing as we move forward in our organization. Now, again, I would also argue they're clearly important to think about as you think about your career also. Then as we move inside this circle here, we have really our immediate industry and competitive environment. So in the middle, we have our company or you as an individual. And around that are people that we deal with regularly and influence and have a big day-to-day impact. Those can be our rival firms. So another company that's producing the same product or service. It can be a rival trying to get the same job we are if we're taking it on to the personal side. It can be buyers or customers. In other words, if we're a company, again, who's buying our products or services, what kind of changes are happening there. Same thing with suppliers, substitute products. We'll talk about that in a minute a little bit more, but substitute products aren't exactly the same as what we make, but they might affect our product. If we were Motorola and we made a flip phone, that smartphone that Apple developed and actually BlackBerry first, that really was a major influence on their business. And they probably didn't react particularly well. Or we might have new entrants. We might have people coming from new geographies, China, India, Vietnam, or we may have somebody just developing, a new product down the street from us that thinks they have a slightly better idea and can do better than we do. So we look at all of that to understand what changes are taking place and start thinking analytically and sort of creatively about how does that influence our products, our services, and how we do business. A more detailed model of that is what's called the 5 forces model of competition. And it's very much similar to the center of that donut we just looked at there. And this was developed by Michael Porter, who professor at Harvard Business School. I had the good fortune to study under when I was there as he was really creating some of these models. And this model really talks about the nature of an industry. What's this industry like? Is it sort of easy to do business in because the factors make it easier to do business, or is it really tough to do business? There's industries which you can almost not do badly because everything's going well. It's growing quickly. There's not a whole lot of competition and everybody does well. And there's other industries for a whole slew of reasons why it is really tough to make money and tough to be successful. But there are companies that do, and we'll talk more about that. So the 5 forces model talks about the rivalry among the competing sellers. That's the people making the same products and services we do. It talks about the power of the buyers, the people that buy our product, our customers. It talks about the power of suppliers. What can they do to us? What kind of impact can they have on us? Again, we talked about those substitute products. Again, if we were making desktop computers back in the 80s and 90s, we were probably surprised a little bit by these laptops. Are they really going to take over the market? Well, they did. And people making laptops were probably surprised by the iPads and various tablets because those were, in fact, viable substitutes for their product. And then lastly, we have those potential new entrants. So all of those factors internally to our direct competitors as well as those other 4 players, they have competitive pressures that in fact influence what our business is going to look like. And we need to understand that because as we develop our strategy and our plans for how we're going to do business, we need to make sure that we're addressing those in the right way and with the right magnitude. So the next thing we do then, of course, is we want to think about our internal environment. So we looked at the external environment. That's very important because what changes are happening around us. Now let's take a look at ourselves. And this is I find this to be sometimes a tough process for people because I think often we either are overly self-critical and don't recognize the strengths we have, or we may be sort of blindly not critical enough and think that we're good at everything and that's fine. Well, that may not be the case either. So there's a tool called the SWOT analysis. I'm sure you've heard of that: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And basically, strengths and weaknesses are internal. Those are the things that characterize us. They're our attributes. We're good at these things. We're not so good at these other things. Now, you don't have to be good at everything, and you can be not very good at some things if it's not important. We talked about Apple. Apple Computer is really good at product innovation and marketing and product launch and technology, but they're not very good at manufacturing. And they don't want to be in manufacturing. They outsource that. And so it's okay to be weak in manufacturing if you're Apple. On the other hand, if you're General Motors, you probably want to be pretty good at manufacturing because you're making cars, a lot of cars every day. So those are internal. And then the external things are opportunities and threats. So those are factors for us. So what kind of opportunities is is there a competitor who is maybe not taking advantage of some things he or she could, and therefore that's an opportunity for us? Or there is a competitor that's coming up with just a whiz bang new product that's really going to make our product jeopardize our product's success, and that's a threat. So clearly, strengths and opportunities are positive things. That's that vertical column there. The strengths are going to help you achieve your objectives if they're the right ones. The opportunities are opportunities that are going to facilitate you achieving your objectives. Likewise, weaknesses, again, unless they're not important to your strategy, are usually negative, and threats are negative. So that SWOT analysis is the important tool we use in internal analysis. And again, you can certainly look at that as an individual. You can say, what are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? Can I address some of my weaknesses? Maybe you need to go back and get an MBA, or maybe you need to get just some specific courses in public speaking or technology. I don't know. So anyway, we can use that tool for ourselves in our career as well as for our organization. So next step is that we want to develop our strategic vision. Remember, we talked about in the 7S model, those superordinate goals. Where do we want to go? Where do we want to take this organization? That vision is forward-looking, and it is based on our mission. I didn't talk about the mission here, but the mission basically is who we are. It kind of defines basically, well, we're a manufacturing company that produces materials or steel or automobiles in the U.S. market. It sort of defines the boundaries of who we are. The vision really, within those boundaries, it defines where we want to go. And so that's really important. And we'll sort of, as we conclude, we'll talk a little bit more about how some people have seen that. Next thing we have to do is we take that vision, which starts off as quantitative. Maybe we want to be the largest maker of widgets in the world, or the most profitable maker of widgets in the world, or providing the best service of widgets in the world. Now what we want to do is we want to translate those into quantifiable objectives. They're not always, some of them may be qualifiable too. So I want to say they're all numbers, but they're certainly measurable, and they're describable, and people can understand if they're achieving them or not. And you may have heard of a tool called the balanced scorecard. In the balanced scorecard, we basically can think of a 2x2 matrix, and we have short-term objectives and long-term objectives or measures, and we have financial objectives or measures and strategic objectives and measures. And I would say it's probably an absolute truism that a good plan or a good set of objectives will have items in each one of those boxes: short-term, long-term, financial, and strategic. And that is in fact how we know that we're achieving that strategic vision. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The next thing, of course, then once we've got those objectives set, and we can put our hands around them or arms around them because they're quantifiable and qualifiable, we then want to make sure that we've refined or developed our strategy. And that's really the set of actions that are going to define where and how we compete. And again, Michael Porter, the professor I mentioned at the Harvard Business School, he developed this tool called the generic strategy matrix. And basically what Porter learned here, or posited, that effectively there's sort of 4 places you can compete as an organization. And again, this is true for a for-profit, absolutely, largely true for a nonprofit. I could tell you about that if we had more time. And I think you could also think about it again for yourself. And so there's two dimensions here. One is how, what's our source of competitive advantage? And broadly, in for-profit business, it's either around cost and price. In other words, what we're really good at, what our advantage is, that we are really good at managing our costs, and therefore we can sell our product or service at a low price to the customer. Or we differentiate, and we differentiate not on price, but we in fact have product features, services that make our customers not care about our price. I mean, within reason, obviously they always care about price a bit, but a person buying a Ferrari is not really particularly worried about the price. They're worried about performance, image, probably those two things really. On the other hand, if you're buying a Yugo, you're probably, if you remember a Yugo, you're probably interested in price, so you'd be over on the left side. So those two broad sources of competitive advantage, cost and differentiation, are very important to understand which one of those you're doing. And then the other piece is, which customer groups are you going after? So this is kind of the how of how we compete, the source of competitive advantage, and the where we compete, which is that scope. Do we go after a narrow group of customers, or do you go after a broad group of customers? Let's talk about an industry I think we can all relate to, and that would be the retail grocery industry. If we think about some of the national players in that, I would propose that if we were to put Aldi on this matrix, we would put it down on the bottom left as a cost-focused competitor. They are price-oriented, and they're going after a niche. They're not trying to serve, the entire market. You won't find an Aldi in every shopping center around an area. You'll find them very typically in some strip shopping centers in certain areas where they're going after a certain demographic of value-oriented shoppers. On the other hand, if we took Walmart, they also compete on price and cost, but they're going after the entire market. They want to sell to everybody, so they're up in that top left box. If we go out to the differentiation focus, I would say that would be somebody like Whole Foods. They're not going after every customer. They're going after the buyers of grocery items. They're looking for healthy items, for organic items. They're not considering price. They want organic, and they don't care if they pay a little bit more for it because that's important to them. And then at the top right is a little more difficult in the grocery industry, but I think we would put people like Kroger, probably Target, where they have groceries, Giant Eagle, regional firm. They're there. They are not trying to compete head-on-head with Walmart on pricing. They're trying to offer either a better shopping experience, a nicer store, a better location, better technology, better selection of goods, and they're up there. Now, one of the concepts, and we'll talk about a little bit later, is that the more competitors you have in one of those boxes, sometimes the tougher that industry is, because we're all trying to compete the same way. So it's nice if you can get that source of competitive advantage and be the only cost-based leader in the broad market. Maybe Walmart is close to that, really, and maybe Aldi is close to that in that bottom left. So, again, if you're in that top right in the grocery industry, there's a lot of players, and they're probably all differentiating themselves in slightly different ways. So we've created our strategy. We've picked one of those generic strategies that Michael Porter developed. Now we need to implement and execute it. And you remember I talked about skills in an organization, or skills of an individual too. One of the things that's good to think about is, if you're an individual that's highly creative and highly analytical, that phase 3, developing, crafting a strategy, is probably exactly where you're going to be good at, because it needs some creative thinking, kind of some entrepreneurial thinking. On the other hand, if you're a good blocker and tackler, or a good nuts and bolts person, this phase 4 is your area. And and organizations need both kind of people. So certainly if you if you're creative, there's a role for you. If you're more of the executor, there's a role for you there too. And they're both important, because certainly a great strategy which isn't executed well is not going to yield good results. And so this is a very important phase. And if in the course we talk about a lot of ways to implement the strategy. You can do joint ventures, you can buy companies, you can do all these things on your own, you can go out and hire people. But all of those things have to be considered, and that's part of that 7S model, where we need to think about, again, do we have the right staff to execute the strategy? Do we have the right skills in there? Do we have the right systems and the structure? And all of that's important to, in fact, doing good execution of a good strategy. Then finally, what's very important, and we talked about the balanced scorecard before, and that is that we're regularly measuring how we're doing. So we want to see how we're doing against those short-term and long-term objectives, against those financial measures and strategic measures. And as we maybe we surpass them, or we don't quite live up to them, we may need to make some revisions somewhere in this process. We may need to even go back all the way and say, hey, did we get that external environment right? Maybe not, and that might have a cascading effect down the whole model. Or it might simply be, we say, we got everything right, but we just didn't execute right in this one area. We got to fix that. Or maybe our objectives were a little too ambitious, or maybe not ambitious enough. So that idea of sort of regular measurement and corrective action is important. If you have huge corrective action, probably there's a major problem. But what I will tell you, and we'll talk about this in a minute, you have to do continual measurement and have to be flexible enough to make continual revisions, because you'll never get this exactly right. You want to get it mostly right. So let's talk about some key concepts then coming out of all of this. First of all, let's talk about industry attractiveness. We talked about that 5 forces model, and what we can learn from that, and what we can learn from actually looking at empirical evidence, is that to the degree to which an industry is attractive or unattractive is not the same for all the participants in the industry. There are companies that can do very well in a very difficult, unattractive industry because they've got the right strategy and they execute it well. The opportunities that any industry presents depends on your ability to capitalize on them. And I would argue that this is also probably true in your career. I have heard people say that, the best predictor of your career success is to be in a good company in a good industry. But, there are companies that are not quite as good, and there's companies and there's industries that are not quite as good. And there are people that do very well in those. So again, that's your choice. And I think basically the thing we can conclude is that you can do well personally, and a company can do well financially and market-wise in a difficult industry. And again, going back to that 5 forces, if we think about that model of the rivals and the buyers and the suppliers, substitute products and new entrants, really when we developed a strategy, what our objective is to make sure that we've developed a strategy that insulates us from the competitive pressure. So again, we want to make sure that we are so good at whatever we want to be good at, whether it's being the low cost and price producer or service provider, or the differentiated, the best performing product, the best customer service. We want to make sure that we are able to insulate ourselves or isolate ourselves from other rivals in there, so that we in fact can perform well despite whatever they're good at. And we want to make sure that, again, that whole execution plan produces sustainable competitive advantage. We have the good skills, and we keep investing in them. That's why I say that HR processes are so important. Once we understand, the kind of people we need, as an example, to have the certain kind of skills in our organization, we need to make sure we hire them, that we train them properly, and that we motivate them and we retain them. So again, getting that competitive advantage and making it sustainable is really important. And if you can do all of that, if you have a great strategy and then great execution, you can be the mover and shaker in your industry, and you in fact can really define the business model. And we can go we go through history and look at companies that define the business model for their industry. I would say that right now, Amazon is defining the business model for online shopping or e-commerce. Now, whether they'll continue to do that forever, we don't know, but for sure, right now they are. And there's other companies in the past, Sears and Roebuck, not doing very well right now, but at one time they defined the business model for the retail industry, and they did everything right. Now, sometimes companies fall, and they're one that has. So some key takeaways from our discussion today. First of all, success for an organization or you as an individual starts with having an executable vision of where you want to go. You got to know where you're going to go, because that's the start of it. A friend of mine from India told me many years ago that Buddha said, if you know where you're going, many roads will get you there. So if you have that vision, then there's a number of ways to get there. And again, as we talked about, you'll make some deviations from time to time because things change. What you don't want is what I kind of think, that old American line of, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And that's exactly right. Any road will get you to nowhere or to someplace you don't know about. So you really want to follow Buddha on this and know where you're going, and then chart that course. A strategy and plan for a strategy execution must support and be in harmony with the other 7 S's, or the other 6 S's: shared vision, style, systems, skills, structure, and staff. You want that 7S model to be coherent, to be cohesive, and to be harmonious. We've got to do regular assessments and future thinking of the external and internal environments, again, both personally in your career as well as for an organization. That's critical to good strategy development and execution. Even the best strategy and execution plan needs fine-tuning, because the external world changes. We know that. The internal environment changes. We may lose a key person. We may get a new owner. We may get a new board of directors or a new CEO, and things change. And so, there's always some kind of changes necessary to this plan. I hope it's fine tuning and not major tuning, because again, that would say that we were really off. There was a German military strategist, von Moltke, who said, the best battle plan never survives the first encounter with the enemy. So you can have a great strategic plan, you can be doing well on your execution, but as the enemy, the rivals, your customers, technology, government regulation, demographics, as those things change, you've got to be able to adjust your battle plan. And that's certainly what von Moltke said back in the 1800s, I believe. And then an organization, an individual can be successful even in a difficult industry or environment with a strategy and a vision and execution that produces that sustainable competitive advantage. So that's really key. So I want to thank you for listening in today. If you'd like more information about this presentation, or you'd like to learn more about Ashland University's MBA programs, please contact Ron Mickler. He's the Executive Director of MBA programs, and his email is there, rmickler@ashland.edu. Again, thank you.